Good evening. My name is Louisa Wood Ruby, and I'm head of research at the Frick Art Reference Library. Thank you for joining us this evening for this exciting program. Tonight, the Frick Center for the History of Collecting is pleased to present a two-part lecture on the Goncourt Brothers and the taste for the 18th century, given by distinguished scholars Olivier Berggruen and Yuriko Jackal. For time considerations, please save your questions until the end of the second talk, and don't forget to silence your cell phones. You can do that now while I'm speaking. Olivier Berggruen is a scholar and curator who has written on Cézanne, Picasso, Matisse, Tanguy, Klee, Bacon, Twombly, and many others, mostly for international museum exhibitions. Mr. Berggruen has worked as a specialist at Sotheby's Impressionist and Modern Art and as director of Artemis Fine Art, both in London. From 2001 to 2007, he was associate curator at the Schöne Kunsthalle in Frankfurt, during which time he curated international retrospectives, including Francis Bacon and the Tradition of Painting, Matisse's paper cutouts, Yves Klein, and Picasso's theater and ballet works, as well as a show of works on paper by Ed Ruscha. In 2009, he curated a Jean-Michel Basquiat retrospective at the Palazzo Ruspoli, Rome, and in 2017, he curated a retrospective of Picasso's neoclassical years at the Scuderie del Quirinale. Currently, he's working on a book of the history of collecting. Today, Mr. Berggruen will speak on art collecting as refuge from modern life. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Louisa, for this very kind introduction, and I'd like to thank the Center for the History of Collecting, Samantha, Louise, and the entire staff at the Frick. Not everyone is necessarily that interested in the Goncourts, but maybe I'll succeed in, and Yuriko will succeed in making you change your mind. Jules and Edmond de Goncourt, art critics, collectors, novelists in 19th century Paris. The brothers Goncourt lived too late to witness the triumph of Romanticism. The golden age of which they dreamed was not ancient Greece, but the Ancien Régime in France, the time before 1798. The golden age of which they dreamed was the period of Louis XVI, of Louis XV, that period, the 18th century. And perhaps at first, inspiration came from Gérard de Nerval, the Romantic poet, his poetic ideal laced with melancholy, the atmosphere of lassitude, the decadent society, nevertheless possessed of an acute sense of life and spirit. There's Nerval shortly before he killed himself in the 1850s. The transition from the spontaneous poetry by Nerval and of other romantics like Alfred de Musset to the poetry of decadence makes Baudelaire the Goncourt's predecessor. In the words of Anita Bruckner, who was my tutor at the Courtauld Institute, and here I quote Anita Bruckner, "With the brothers Goncourt, we arrive at the final phase of the Baudelairean attitude in which the realm of art in general and the cult of images in particular signify consolation, compensation for the ills of contemporary life, a sublimation of human appetite." End of quote. The brothers Goncourt sacrificed their day-to-day existence in pursuit of artistic pleasures. It was as though the fever of emotions garnered through fleeting aesthetic glimpses was sufficiently rewarding, revealing a distant beauty, one that was far removed from nature and from life. They declared that all great writers were destined to sacrifice their lives at the expense of common day-to-day pleasures. Theirs was an almost neurotic existence, a subtle, bitter sensitivity causing their nervous system much pain and irritation. Such was the price of posterity and immortality. It was not by sheer chance that they subscribed to Baudelaire's conception of life in opposition to life, the world of images making up for the illusions of modern life. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, the worldly, elegant, frivolous lifestyle of the aristocracy had vanished. Born into the 19th century, the Goncourts' almost sickly obsession with the past, their nostalgia for the Ancien Régime, sometimes gave way to a morbid fascination with modern society, as though they took unconcealed pleasure in its most revolting and unflattering aspects, and could not draw themselves away from it. Their historical studies of the 18th century were followed by contemporary novels about the lower classes of society. Modernity aroused their curiosity and also their disgust. The 19th century sanctified the triumph of the individual, which was celebrated by capitalist morality. This triumph was also that of the ego in art. In the face of disenchantment and a debased century that had been grounded in mediocrity, the Goncourts drew the resources they needed to live and create from the cult of their own subjectivity. Art became a refuge for their wounded sensitivities. They sought to escape the vulgar tendencies of modernity by indulging in the rare sensations that inanimate artifacts could evoke. From this bloodless, exhausted world sprang subtle, fleeting moments of joyful sensations. Their passion for art objects originated with their aunt, Nephthalie de Courmont, a modest collector whom they idolized. Edmond bought his first drawing, a Bouchers watercolor, at the age of 16. Soon after, the brothers began to scour antique shops and dealers of what they referred to as stuffy objects. They also took up painting and drawing. In the 1840s, Edmond paid regular visits to the auction houses. The brothers' financial independence was secure after the death of their mother in September 1848. After traveling to Italy and North Africa, the brothers dabbled in writing. They started collecting in earnest in 1856, after acquiring roughly 100 drawings at an enormous auction in Paris, and they also started buying Japanese artifacts. When they started, old master drawings and Japanese objects were not much sought by collectors, but Edmond, who took the collecting mania much further than his younger brother, sacrificed to it most of the gains from his literary successes. The collecting frenzy was not simply a form of diversion from modern life, it met a profound need, the demand of a sensitivity that fed on constant contact with works of art. Such a reverential attitude to obsolete forms of life was later decried by Friedrich Nietzsche. And here I'd like to quote from a little-known essay by Nietzsche called On the Utility and Liability of History. Quote, "The scholarly habit revolves with self-satisfied egotism around its own axis. Then we view the repugnant spectacle of a blind mania to collect, of a restless gathering together of everything that once existed. The human being envelopes himself in the smell of mustiness." End of quote. Edmond's world, in particular, was filled with lifeless objects, and from this bloodless, esoteric world sprang a life of subtle, fleeting sensations. Unfortunately, the rarefied nature of aesthetic pursuits also seeped into the brothers' daily life. They shut themselves off for several days at a time, talking and writing. Living together only aggravated their suffering, for they confided in one another each and every day, reinforcing their narrow introspection. In their famous journal, they became the subject of their own analytical experiments, in which pain was caused by anxiety and hypersensitivity. They made themselves ill by self-analysis. Their heavy, cruel, painful perception of things was compounded by the disastrous lifestyle of two young writers shut up in their house, endlessly smoking cigars and drinking indigestible wines. Their lives revealed the first signs of the oncoming fin de siècle spirit, decadence and nervous irritation excessive delicacy. They were high-strung, morbidly sensitive, always anxious and dissatisfied, as seen as the repeated lamentations throughout the journal. In daily life, the slightest bit of adversity was enough to make them irritable. Bouts of depression were followed by rare moments of euphoria. The most significant symptom of their nervousness and depression was a bleak fear of external noises, which had tortured them from a young age. Lucky they never got to live in New York in today's age. Their constant quest for tranquility, for an environment favorable to the pursuit of the arts and literature, was by no means resolved by the purchase of a house in the sleepy village of Auteuil, just north of Paris. The brothers Goncourt made their name in a series of novels in which they described with clinical accuracy the vices and suffering of the lower classes of society. These novels were bestsellers. Just to give you an example, Germinie Lacerteux was then adapted into a play, and here we see Réjeanne, who was the most celebrated actress of her time, together with Sarah Bernard in the role of Germinie Lacerteux. The heroes of these novels helplessly watch their own decline, a fate that befell Jules in real life when he suffered a collapse and eventual death from syphilis, while Edmond had the misfortune of witnessing his brother's demise. The brothers searched for decadence, both moral and physical misery, among ordinary people, while thinking that their own lives were reserved for nobler occupations and inclinations. Edmond went on to create the myth of a younger brother who had died for the good causes of art and literature, which is not entirely false, yet misleading. After the death of Jules in the early 1870s, Edmond turned increasingly to the emotional pleasures of art by writing about the past and by indulging in his passion for collecting. Before evoking their collection, I just want to say a brief word about their writing style. They were indeed great stylists. Through their writing, they tried to restore the richness of a vision that had disintegrated due to the ephemeral nature of sensations. They named their method l'écriture artiste. Their writing followed the eye, became, so to say, analogous to it, bearing in mind a succession of states of consciousness without arranging them in line with rational criteria. The description of surfaces takes the form of an accumulation of disparate notions, the writer striving to correct a constantly changing impression. Their feverish sentences, where everything seemed to be accumulated and nothing was ever completed, was like a distillation of their lives. The journal provides a fascinating insight into their ideas about collecting art. These ideas are particularly interesting, I find, because they run counter to many common assumptions of the time. To the Goncourts, eclectic taste was a cardinal sin for collectors. A collector who advocated diversity was not open-minded, but lacked individual sensibility and personal judgment. In other words, real taste was defined by exclusion. Collections by individuals were radically different from those found in museums. What mattered to the Goncourts was personal intuition. One didn't need to have artistic opinions like one has political opinions. To them, opinion was the enemy of taste. Taste had to express a highly developed form of subjectivity, removing itself from the diktat of existing opinions or criteria. According to the Goncourts, good collections belonged to the private realm, reflecting their author's taste and discernment. As soon as it conformed to institutional models, a private collection failed. Needless to say, the only great collection of that time was theirs. A crucial aspect of a collection's character was linked to the history of objects. Edmond admitted that a taste for antiques had already existed in his family, alluding in the journal to the boule armoire that he had inherited from his mother. Objects gained prestige because of the provenance and their exhibition history. A work of art unleashed a wealth of memories from a distant past. What mattered was an object's intense evocative power. An object could also provoke feelings of longing and desire, Perhaps Edmond's fondness for recalling precious objects was akin to the amorous discourse that was prevalent during the Ancien Régime, and particularly in the literature of the Ancien Régime, tales of which there are echoes in the 19th century in Théophile Gautier's Fortunio, or in a little-known novel by Baudelaire called La Fanfarlot from 1847, a fictional account of Baudelaire's affair with Jeanne Duval. I can even mention a poem, La Chambre Double. Baudelaire saw this dream palace full of wonderful objects as a substitute for women. In their own collection, the Goncourts pursued 18th century art, French art, which was no longer fashionable in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century. Efforts to revive it culminated with the publication over 15 years of the 12 parts making up l'art du XVIIIe siècle. It included artists such as Watteau, Bouchers, Quentin de la Tour, Fragonard, Chardin, Greuze, and even Prudhon, as well as lesser-known artists such as Gravelot, Eisen, Cochin, and the brothers Saint-Aubin. Here's a portrait by one of the Saint-Aubins, work that was reproduced in one of the fascicules from l'art du XVIIIe siècle. This work is now in a private collection. For the Goncourts, the Ancien Régime projected a nostalgic image of society, of elegance, of good taste, of refined manners. Furthermore, the 18th century was marked by a cult of beauty far removed from utilitarian and moral preoccupations. The Goncourts found their ideal in the 18th century woman, her sensual, elegant appearance, her taste for wit, her carefree lightness of character mingled with veiled melancholy irony. This woman, so inclined towards appearances, could be found in the delicate drawings by Watteau, Boucher, and Augustin de Saint-Aubin. The Goncourt brothers disliked the modern woman. She was unlike her elder sister. The modern woman, which was devoted to domestic tasks, deprived her of her aristocratic pleasures, of a frivolous existence enjoyed by upper-class women in the Ancien Régime. Drawings, which formed the basis of their collection, had the advantage of being fairly affordable compared to paintings or sculptures. As I mentioned, Edmond bought his first drawing of Boucher in 1848. Then there was a pause, and then between 1857 and 1870, the brothers acquired a further 716 sheets, emphasizing works by artists making up the series L'Art du XVIIIe siècle. Quentin de la Tour, Moreau-le-Jeune, Oudry, the Saint-Aubins, Clodion, Chardin. Of all the artists, Watteau, not without justification, was considered the greatest artist. After an auction of their collection in March of 1870, 411 drawings were left. Between 1877 and 1880, Edmond slowed down, acquiring no more than 20 or 30 sheets. By then, he had become passionate about Japanese art. Nonetheless, the sale of his estate in 1897, a year after he died, still comprised nearly 600 sheets. More so than his novels, it was really the house at Auteuil that was Edmond's most perfect creation, and it survives in his meticulous description of its contents in La Maison d'un Artiste. The book came relatively late in Edmond's life, long after his younger brother's painful death in 1870, after the Franco-Prussian War, after the Paris Commune, both of which forced him to seek refuge in the Paris apartment of his friend Philippe Burti, and after his novel La Fille Elisa had been hailed as a masterpiece of naturalist prose, a catalogue of modern horrors ranging from poverty to disease and prostitution. Edmond's two-volume account of his collecting mania was so crucial to him that Émile Zola could write in his review of the book that, and here I quote Zola, "The house saved the writer," end of quote. Edmond declared, "This collection is my wealth and my pride." Reading La Maison d'un Artiste, the reader is easily seized by a sense of oppression and dizziness in the face of such elaborate, meticulous descriptions. The house itself was oppressive. Tapestries and brocades covered all the walls. Edmond paid close attention to the decor in which no surface, including the ceilings, was left untouched. The entrance displayed biscuits de Sèvres vases and various terracottas by Clodion. Each harmonious interior conspired to showcase Edmond's great pride, his extensive collection of drawings, conceived in the spirit and in honor of the great 18th century connoisseur Mariette. Edmond also decided that drawings were best seen against the red background. It follows that his collection was displayed against the red cotton fabric over boiseries painted and polished in black. The book, La Maison d'un Artiste, is divided into two parts. The first part focuses on drawings and the second part on works of art from the Far East. What makes the book original and at times charming is that each chapter is devoted to a separate room. Edmond does not shy away from giving his opinion on the various artists he spent so much time collecting. In the end, his taste in connoisseurship became a standard reference for our appreciation of 18th century French drawings. Each room was arranged to give the impression of containing a series of boxes. In the dining room, the walls, the endowments, textiles were arranged so as to envelope a precious collection of drawings. Each room boasted a series of decorative panels strategically placed in order to enhance the effects of the precious works of art. This helped protect them and enhance them through elaborate visual effects. Drawings were set in period frames, given blue mounts, shown against a red velvety background mounted over black boiseries. Edmond took great delight in creating unified, harmonious, shimmering surfaces, combining in a grand scheme bronze, porcelain, lacquer, and embroidery. The delicate Japanese albums on the first floor landing were inserted within a triple-layered structure of heavily appointed wall coverings, assorted potteries, and boxes with lacquered panels. Over the years, Edmond felt increasingly attracted to Japanese art. In 1864, he wrote of Japanese artists, and here I quote Edmond, "Everything they do is taken from observation. They represent what they see, this incredible effects of the sky, the stripes on a mushroom, the transparency of a jellyfish. Their art copies nature, as does Gothic art. Basically, there is no paradox in saying that the Japanese album and a painting by Watteau are drawn from an intimate study of nature. Nothing like this in the Greeks. Their art, except for sculpture, is false and invented." End of quote. In the 1860s, the brothers had acquired a handful of Japanese woodblock prints. In the aftermath of the Universal Exhibition of 1868, they were quick to take credit for Japanese artifacts becoming fashionable. By then, they had bought a large Japanese bronze vase for 2,000 francs. It appeared in Jean-François Raffaelli's portrait of Edmond from 1888, in which a Louis XV armchair, a Watteau drawing, and a statue by Falconet were also featured. I apologize for the poor quality of the slide. Objects they collected included netsukes, porcelain, Chinese and Japanese bronzes, Satsuma earthenware, which was soft and ivory-colored with polychrome and gold decorations on its crackled glaze, and various other small objects made from precious materials, some lacquered. In the 1870s, Edmond pursued textiles, painted or embroidered, kakemonos, fukusas. Fukusas are the textiles used usually during the tea ceremony. Delicate sculptures, netsukes, Satsuma ceramics, all of which were bought from the specialists such as Auguste Sichel, Siegfried Bing, De la Harde, and Hayashi. Cabinet de l'Extrême-Orient is the name given to the second half of La Maison d'un Artiste. Towards the end of his life, Edmond turned to writing about Japanese artists with his monographs on Utamaro, 1891, and Hokusai, 1896. Drawn from the poetical realism of Japanese art, he wrote studies that broke new ground in France, though by no means the first writings devoted to Japanese art, which had gained in popularity. There's a book now at Princeton, formerly in the collection of Edmond de Goncourt. In the next slide, there's a first edition of Utamaro. Although La Maison d'un Artiste is not a catalogue per se, what makes it fascinating is that it is an autobiography articulated through the prism of objects. It is unique in terms of its breadth, erudition, and evocative power. Its modern-day equivalent would be Mario Praz's Museum of Life. Time seems to have stopped, if only within the confine of Praz's superb sepulchre. Praz was an Italian 20th century scholar based in Rome. The outside world is kept at bay in this world of refined scholarship. Art and books serve as a barricade against the external world. To summarize, mustiness, antiquarian taste at Edmond, the way in which artifacts are matted, framed, encased in various layers, preserved and mummified like relics so precious that all traces of life have vanished, a kind of worship of the past seen through an aseptic lens with a fear of touching, of getting close to life. We might ask, where did modern life fit in the lives of two writers who had rejected modernity while spending so much time describing it in their novels? Impressionism was too crude and raw for them. On the whole, Edmond liked traditional painters who rejected Impressionism and kept to flexible lines and drawn brushstrokes. He described Manet's paintings as opaque, matte, and plaster-like. Only Manet's skills as a watercolorist were praised. He rejected Degas and the Impressionists along the same lines. Curiously enough, Degas and Edmond de Goncourt frequented the same social circles. Edmond found the stylized lines of Forain and Helleux far more attractive. These artists had devised a light, flexible style whose shortened lines and freshness of composition suggested an immediacy of movement reminiscent of the previous century. He also liked the Neapolitan painter Giuseppe de Nittis, who painted a melancholy portrait of him. De Nittis evoked a worldly society, paintings that were languorous, melancholy, yet with a slightly veiled gaiety. Edmond also admired Rodin's drawings and Eugène Carriere's evanescent figures that rose from shadows floating in space. But to Edmond, the only real painter of modern life was Paul Gavarni, whom he preferred to Daumier. In his lithographs and drawings, Gavarni gave a visual expression to the social changes brought on by a modern world. In 1875, the Goncourts devoted to Gavarni their only monograph dedicated to a living artist. At the end of his life, Edmond expressed the desire that all his treasured possessions be dispersed at auction and thus passed on to others who will enjoy them as much as he did. The collection, which is a fragment of Edmond's imagination, only survives because he was a gifted writer. Today, the brothers' novels are largely forgotten, overshadowed by Maupassant and Zola. The journal contains such uncharitable and mean-spirited description of their contemporaries that it can only be seen as testimony to a pair of petty, introverted minds. The name Goncourt is remembered today chiefly because of the literary prize that Edmond established in memory of his brother. Although it is the supreme literary award, winners only receive a nominal amount of money and a festive meal at Rouen, which I'm told is about to lose its lone Michelin star. The aestheticism they advocated did not take root in France as it did in England, where the tradition of Ruskin and Walter Pater centered around the study of the Renaissance and its legacy. And this tradition then continued into the 20th century with Adrian Stokes and other connoisseurs and collectors such as Dennis Mowen and Brinsley Ford. The Goncourt's influence in America will be the subject of Yuriko Jackal's presentations in a few minutes' time. Despite their maddening ways, the Goncourt's legacy in the history of taste is assured, but it is easy to caricature their over-refined and elitist ways, aggravated by the shunning of modernity. There are echoes of the Goncourt's aestheticism in the life of Count Robert de Montesquieu, whom Edmond knew, feared, and derided like many of his contemporaries in the literary world. I know that Yuriko will speak a little bit about Montesquieu, so I will be very, very brief and only say that Montesquieu came from an old French family that counted D'Artagnan among its ancestors, and Montesquieu had great aspirations for his rather common and mannered poetry, but he encouraged Whistler's career, and like the Goncourts, followed the fashion for all things Japanese, even dressing himself as a Mikado for formal photo sessions. His various houses in Neuilly, Versailles, and Le Vésinet were decorated with utmost care, with family portraits, empire furniture, kakemonos, and prints by Whistler. Not only were the interiors theatrical, but so was his life, his manners, and of course, his appearance, as Boldini's famous portrait testifies, the gentleman in the gray frock coat. But I know that Yuriko will speak a great deal more about Montesquieu. The effete poet aristocrat befriended the young Proust, who in turn incorporated much of his manner in À la recherche du temps perdu under the guise of Baron de Charlus. Montesquieu was also identified, not without spite, as the fictional character Jean des Esseintes by Huysmans in his famous novel À rebours. Huysmans's aesthete is indeed a caricature, but a telling one of the decadent spirit in which the gap between life and art could no longer be bridged, but the Goncourts and Montesquieu could redeem themselves through their wit and occasional talent. I will close by showing a still from a splendid film by Luchino Visconti, known here in America as Conversation Piece, inspired by Mario Praz, I just mentioned, and also the long line of gentlemen scholars, of which Edmond de Goncourt was arguably the first. An elderly scholar, played by Burt Lancaster, sits in a vast, magnificent study enveloped by precious antiques, a tenebrous labyrinth of Renaissance bronzes, English paintings, and rare books. Such heavy material splendor is redolent of a bygone era, that of connoisseurs in the mold of Bernard Berenson or Roberto Longhi, the scholars whose rarefied knowledge was imparted to a select group of cognoscenti. Unsurprisingly, the professor, an American-born Roman scholar and collector, lives alone, divorced, his defense against the outside world, his faithful housekeeper. He has succumbed to aesthetic contemplation and to the pursuit of high culture, keeping the outside world at bay. Is the professor really satisfied with a life that is devoid of family, of personal connections, confined to the suffocating veneration of idols? Visconti's film becomes a meditation on the difficulties of separating art and life. Life does indeed have a way of taking over, and the two cannot be dissociated, as Edmond de Goncourt knew, despite his assurances to the contrary. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Olivier. It's now my pleasure to introduce Yuriko Jackal, who is curator of French paintings at the Wallace Collection in London, where she is currently working on an exhibition project focused around the museum's 8 paintings by Jean-Honoré Fragonard. She holds a PhD from the Université de Lyon and master's degrees from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and the École du Louvre in Paris. Her research focuses on materials and techniques in the 18th century, histories of collecting, and the art of Jean-Baptiste Greuze. Her book manuscript on Greuze's expressive heads, based on her doctoral dissertation, was awarded the 2016 Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art Prize and is soon to be published. Prior to joining the Wallace, Dr. Jackal was assistant curator of French painting at the National Gallery here in Washington. There she curated the acclaimed exhibition Fragonard, the Fantasy Figures. She also curated an exhibition on Hubert Robert at the Musée du Louvre in Washington in 2016-17. And in summer of 2017, she was curator of America Collects 18th Century French Painting, a close look at taste of French art in the US. This evening, she will be speaking to us, as Olivier mentioned, about research stemming from this project on French art in the United States. Please welcome Dr. Jackal.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Louisa. Thank you and Samantha for organizing this event and inviting me to be here. I also want to thank Olivier for suggesting that we do this together and giving me the opportunity to revisit some of the research that I did in the course of preparing my America Collects exhibition. And I also want to thank Sally Brazil, who I think is here tonight, who was incredibly generous in helping me and piloting me through the richness of the Frick archives as I was working on that show. So I want to start, incongruously enough, with a picture taken in the Paris metro, in the station to which the Goncourt brothers gave their name. This station, Goncourt, is located in the 10th arrondissement. It sits on line 11 of the Paris metro, which runs between Châtelet and the Porte de Lilas. The station is near the Rue des Goncourt, also named after the brothers. The street was renamed in 1899, 3 years after Edmond's death. The metro station opened long after, in 1935. I think the brothers would have hated the idea that their metro station, indicated by a red star, sits in the heart of one of Paris's busiest neighborhoods. The 10th arrondissement is on the opposite side of the city from all they held dear: the leafy boulevards of the 16th arrondissement, the refined salons of the 7th arrondissement. In a way, that's the trouble with influence. One cannot control it. And one can never really tell how it will make itself felt generations down the line. Do commuters rushing to work on Monday morning at 8 a.m. ever think of the brothers who gave the name Goncourt not only to a metro station, but also to one of the world's most elite literary prizes? I can't speak for Parisian commuters, but this evening I want to make a case for the influence of the Goncourt brothers in an arena closer to home, America, and more specifically, New York. Like the nature of influence itself, much here is elusive and circumstantial. What you're about to hear is something like an art historical version of a snapshot taken out of a train window of a subway platform. It has been sold, the furniture of Versailles, the magnificent furniture of embroidered blue silk, ornamented with flowers and peacock feathers, and with black ribbons fringed with silk. It has been sold. The lament belongs to the Goncourt brothers, and it embodies much of the regret and nostalgia that pervades their writing. As the children of a bourgeois army officer and an aristocratic mother whose own father had been guillotined during the Terror, they saw French history as beginning with the death of Louis XIV in 1715 and ending in 1793 with the execution of Marie Antoinette. Faced with the commercialization and industrialization of the Second Empire, they longed for a more serene and sumptuous place, made up of gilding and porcelain, finely woven tapestries, and paintings in sparkling shades of lemon yellow, delicate greens, and vibrant pinks. This was a France that had existed under the sign of the Rococo, the style of decoration and painting that privileged asymmetry and sinuosity. This France had been sold off following the Revolution and was now no more. The passionate words shown on the slide were first committed to paper in 1855. But the quote, translated into English exactly as I'm giving it here, reappeared in an article also written in English in 1878. And this article, which credits the Goncourt with the revival of interest in the subtle and delicate qualities of the 18th century, appeared in an American journal, the Atlantic Monthly. 7 years later, another piece published in the New York magazine Art Amateur celebrated the Goncourt's taste and scholarly expertise. These examples suggest a measure of recognition in the American press, which begs the question, how did what was still a fairly new country, premised on ideas of democracy and egalitarianism, interpret and digest these nostalgic elegies for a past shaped by courtly culture? Again, we come to the issue of how to talk concretely about influence. By way of response, I want to focus on 3 modes of engagement with French art enacted by New York collectors of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Part 1, collecting the celebrity souvenir. Another incongruous start. A caricature made by the French academic artist Jean-Georges Vibert. This little sketch shows an unexpected scene. A man has scaled a wall, apparently with the aid of a ladder, whose upper rungs are just barely visible to the viewer. His identity seems clear enough. Even without the inscription in the upper right and the date, 1896, which corresponds to the year in which Edmond died, one recognizes the traits described by his friend, the devoutly right-wing journalist Léon Daudet. I quote, "Goncourt was an aristocrat, from the tips of his delicate fingers and the points of his white mustache to his dark, flaming glance." End quote. What is less clear is what Edmond is doing shown thus, his eyebrows lifted with concentration, his eyes bulging, fixed on some object below. The wall against which this restless, searching Edmond leans gives us a clue. It bears the label Guilloté, a name that viewers would associate with Joseph Louis, Marquis de Guilloté. He was a politician who in April 1868 had passed a privacy law in the Assemblée nationale. Henceforth, journalists were barred from making allegations on matters relative to private life by a legal wall, one that was thereafter known as the Mur Guilloté. Thus, the drawing touches upon a darker side of Edmond de Goncourt, lover of the French Rococo, but also devout anti-Semite and inveterate gossip hound, who faithfully, one might say obsessively, committed every salacious detail of Parisian literary and artistic life to his journal. Part of this huge project, a total of 22 volumes, was written in collaboration with Jules from 1850 to 1870. After Jules' death, the rest was continued by Edmond alone up until a few weeks prior to his own demise. Edmond had intended to keep this text unpublished until 20 years after his death, and he initially kept secret its very existence. But pride got the better of him. Beginning in 1886, extracts, then whole volumes began to see the light, with explosive results. Edmond's gossipy style, attention to detail, and nearly perfect memory ensured that few of his friends escaped unscathed, while out-and-out rivals such as Émile Zola were roundly excoriated. A choice extract from October 1857. Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, had supper at the table next to ours. He was without a cravat, his shirt open at the neck and his head shaved, just as if he were to be guillotined. A single affectation, his little hands washed and cared for, the nails kept scrupulously clean. The face of a maniac, a voice that cuts like a knife, and a precise elocution that tries to copy Saint-Just and succeeds. The avid curiosity over the goings-on of celebrity Parisians that pervades the journal also carries over into the art historical writings. But here the starring celebrities were a trio of impossibly elegant and fashionable ladies, all queens, or very, very nearly so. There was Marie Antoinette, whose poignant yearning for normalcy in the midst of the constraints of court life resulted in a fantasy dairy equipped with milk pails manufactured in Sèvres porcelain. There was the vivacious Madame du Barry, who rose from humble origins to catch Louis XV's roving eye. And there was the refined Marquise de Pompadour, whose discernment ensured her place as godmother and queen of the Rococo. Edmond's fascination for the minutiae of their lives is as obvious in his books as it is in his personal correspondence. On one occasion, he advised Gustave Flaubert on the best place to procure authentic 18th century clothing. On another, he wrote excitedly of his discovery in the Encyclopédie of Louis XIV's allergies to hair powder. This obsession with celebrity informed Edmond's collecting as it is presented in La Maison d'un Artiste, the 2-volume guide to his little hôtel particulier in what is now Paris's 16th arrondissement. Published in 1871, the book is structured as a series of unrelated physical descriptions of works of art, 600 drawings, books, original documents relating to the 18th century. The book brings Edmond's interest in discrete objects into sharp relief. His numerous purchases had been ferreted out in antiquary shops and at the stalls of the bouquinistes lining the Seine. Drawings by the likes of Watteau were unpopular and could be had for next to nothing. Snatched from dealers' dust heaps, these objects were acquired with passion. In fact, Edmond described collecting as a substitute for romantic love. More than aesthetic perfection, what he looked for was the aura of emotional intensity endowed by a brush with previous celebrity owners. In part, this was pragmatic. An important provenance typically certifies a high level of craftsmanship. But these collected objects were also precious souvenirs of a time that had been inexorably swept away by the Revolution. He proudly writes that his Grand Salon, shown in a photograph of 1883, contained a paired commode and secrétaire bearing the mark of Marie Antoinette. The bedroom, also shown here, was ornamented with vases in Celadon porcelain that had once belonged to the Marquise de Pompadour. Surrounded on all sides by Souvenir, Edmond wrote that he could imagine himself awakening in that lost era that had been, quote, the object of the studies and loves of my life. Once Americans fully embraced the hunt for royal souvenirs, they dominated the market thanks to their superior financial resources. In 1882, at the sale of the Hamilton Palace collection, the London Times declared that the, quote, pieces of Marie Antoinette have a claim on the purses of millionaires. The works in question were an exquisitely crafted black and gold Japanese lacquer commode and its companion secrétaire by Jean-Henri Riesner, with gilt bronze mounts attributed to Pierre Gautier. They were snapped up by Samson Wertheimer over the head of underbidder Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild. Not surprisingly, the dealer acted on behalf of a bona fide millionaire, Alva, the Alabama-born wife of the railroad magnate William Kissam Vanderbilt. Intelligent and energetic, Alva had married into the newly wealthy Vanderbilt clan in 1875, and I'm showing two photographs of her here, one taken the year of her wedding and one taken on the occasion of a famous costume ball, to which I'll return shortly. The third photo shows the facade of her home at 660 Fifth Avenue. Alva planned and oversaw the construction of this stately mansion, a French Renaissance-style chateau, that would, she was determined, cement the Vanderbilts' place in New York society. She was also a discerning collector. This combination of upward mobility and passion lent itself to the pursuit of souvenirs, and what souvenirs were more conspicuous markers of taste than those with a royal pedigree? Alva presented her Marie Antoinette furniture at the center of a show-stopping Louis XV-style white and gold salon, designed and built in Paris by Jules et Fils, and then shipped to New York and painstakingly reassembled on site by French craftsmen. This made-to-measure room and the queenly furniture it contained prompted Alva's daughter Consuelo Vanderbilt to recall in 1952, I quote, "In a white drawing room hung a fine set of Bouchers tapestries. Here were the beautiful lacquer secrétaire and commode with bronzes chiseled by Gautier, made for Marie Antoinette." Not long after her acquisition of the Riesner furniture, Alva purchased another royal souvenir, Boucher's Toilette of Venus. This was a glamorous depiction of the goddess seated in a haze of diaphanous fabrics and gilded furniture. The Goncourt had cataloged the painting in question and provided a detailed history. Along with its pendant, the Bath of Venus, it once graced Madame de Pompadour's appartement des bains at the Château de Bellevue, probably as a flattering allusion to that royal mistress's own beauty and refinement. Alva acquired the painting after the highly remarked Berggruen sale of 1885, where its illustrious history was recounted in the introduction. Perhaps with Pompadour's original installation in mind, Alva placed the work in her own boudoir. From sale room to 660 Fifth Avenue, the provenances of Marie Antoinette's furniture and Pompadour's painting were consistently highlighted. This was the practice rather than the exception. Royal backstories were a boon to canny dealers, aware that names redolent with Rococo glamour were likely to open the purses of millionaires, and they did not hesitate to play up such connections. In 1915, Henry Clay Frick carried off what was perhaps the most spectacular royal souvenir of all, Fragonard's painted panels of an evolving love affair in a lush garden setting. Until this acquisition, Frick had shown little interest in 18th-century French painting, but Fragonard's ensemble, known collectively as the Progress of Love, was already famous on both sides of the Atlantic. The 4 large panels had been designed for Madame du Barry's pleasure pavilion at Louveciennes, executed at her command, and ultimately rejected in favor of a more static series by Joseph-Marie Vien. Fragonard's rejected paintings were rediscovered in Grasse in the south of France in the mid-19th century. Ultimately, they were purchased by J. Pierpont Morgan for his London home at Prince's Gate. The paintings were revealed to an American audience in 1912 when they were exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, along with other objects from Morgan's collection. Publicity was intense. René Jackall described the works as Madame du Barry's gorgeous paintings showing the, quote, most beautiful romance of love and youth, end quote. E. Jackall and Wildenstein inaugurated an exhibition devoted to Fragonard on January 31st, 1914. Shortly thereafter, Frick purchased the paintings for a high price, with Davines acting as his intermediary. By May 1916, the Progress of Love was installed here, in this very building. His eyes apparently open to the delights of the 18th century, Frick went on to acquire by Davines 8 allegorical panels showing the arts and sciences, purchased as by Bouchers. These came with a Pompadour pedigree. They had initially been in her Château de Crécy. They were installed in Mrs. Frick's boudoir by the decorator Elsie de Wolfe, and they're shown here in their original installation in a painting by American artist Walter Gay. I'm also showing Walter Gay's painting of the Fragonard room made for Helen Clay Frick in 1926, to which I'll return. Part 2, Collecting Camp. On March 18, 1914, the same year he purchased The Progress of Love, Frick bought James McNeill Whistler's arrangement in black and gold. Completed in 1892, the painting depicts a sitter who could proudly trace his ancestry to the early Crusaders, who was a devout royalist and a symbolist poet. This, of course, is Count Robert de Montesquieu, the inspiration for Proust's Baron de Charlus. Edmond de Goncourt was a friend. Goncourt was fascinated by Montesquieu's noble lineage and refined bearing. And for his part, Montesquieu owned all of the brothers' books. He also attended their literary salon, and he subscribed heartily to their passion for the 18th century. Like Edmond de Goncourt, Montesquieu was a clear believer in the celebrity souvenir. He owned a cane that had once belonged to Louis XV, an accessory that features prominently in his portrait by Boldini of 1897. On the grounds of his house in Le Vésinet, he constructed a garden pavilion modeled after Marie Antoinette's Temple of Love at Versailles. There, he installed a pink marble tub that had adorned Madame de Pompadour's bathroom. The exact function ascribed by Montesquieu to these celebrity souvenirs brings us to another mode of engaging with art. For Montesquieu, these carefully chosen accessories referenced his own exquisitely turned-out person. Rather than longing for the past, like his friend Edmond, he literally clothed himself in its vestiges and brought the past to life. In fact, he wrote a poem beginning with the line, "I am the sovereign of transitory things." And in Boldini's painting of him, he holds the cane like a scepter, contemplating it attentively, even lovingly. As an extension of this fashionable persona, Montesquieu was famous for throwing elaborate parties, carefully orchestrated to replicate the ambiance of the Fête Galante, or featuring historical reenactments known as tableaux vivants. In 1894, he hosted a party at Versailles that was described in the press by Marcel Proust as an enchanted moment where, I quote, "for a few hours we believed we were living in the days of Louis XIV." To critical observers, this illusion of the person and the material context smacked of preciousness. The poet Jean Laurent wrote in reference to the Boldini portrait, "Monsieur de Montesquieu takes communion before his cane, swooning before it as Narcissus might swoon before a mirror." Montesquieu's extreme mannerisms were captured visually by the cartoonist Georges Goursat, known as Sem, who depicted the Count transposed from one context to the next, parties, shopping, but always with the same characteristic backbend. Looking at these images, it's easy to give credence to the description provided by Proust's biographer, William Sansom. I quote, "Tall, black-haired, Kaiser-mustached, he cackled and screamed in weird attitudes, giggling in high soprano, hiding his black teeth behind an exquisitely gloved hand, the poser absolute." But to American audiences hungry for stories of glamorous festivities held in the French capital, such trickled-down anecdotes were catnip. For this audience, the illusion of fashion, art, and social gatherings was an easy sell. They were already more or less familiar with the Empress Eugenie's affection for Marie Antoinette. Eugenie's favorite artist, Winterhalter, cited 18th century dress in his intimate, Fête Galante-like portrait of her. With her wardrobe by the avowed father of Parisian high fashion, Charles Frederick Worth, Eugenie set an international taste at court and abroad. For those across the Atlantic, her fondness for lavish trimming and elegant silhouettes was breathlessly described in publications such as the American fashion periodical Gaudie's Magazine and Ladies' Book. Alva Vanderbilt's sister-in-law, Alice, famously wore a dress made by Worth to the Vanderbilt Costume Ball of 1883, and that's shown in the center of the slide. Americans were also aware of the activities of Worth's great rival, the couturier Jacques Doucet, whose clinging, delicate creations were coveted by women from Sarah Bernhardt to, in fiction, Marcel Proust's Albertine. And Doucet was an impassioned collector of French art, a fact that manifestly improved his reputation in the American press. A news report published in the Illustrated American in 1891 comments, I quote, "Jacques Doucet, the great dressmaker, has the most beautiful collection of objects of the period of Louis XVI. Partly because of the respect this fact inspires, the women crowd his salon, which are charmingly fitted in the manner of his favorite period, and upon whose walls hangs a portrait of Marie Antoinette's favorite dressmaker." Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp introduced a term and a sensibility that might be proposed here as an overarching framework for understanding Robert de Montesquieu's effect. Camp is the love of artifice, exaggeration, excess, and frivolity. It is an exuberant and playful sensibility, an aesthetic that lives on the surface. Unlike the related kitsch, it is self-conscious and delights in being recognized and identified. As a style that thrives upon recognition and acknowledgement, camp is a group ethos more than an individual one. Montesquieu's persona and the fancy dress parties he staged offered an opening onto an intriguing realm of aristocratic sociability. And indeed, 18th century fancy dress parties became, from the mid-19th century, a popular form of entertainment among New York's elite. One of the most impressive of these was the Versailles-themed ball organized in 1905 by James Hazen Hyde, majority shareholder of the Equitable Life Insurance Society of the United States. Sherry's restaurant at 44th Street and Fifth Avenue was done over to resemble the gardens of Versailles, with flowers covering the walls from floor to ceiling. Hyde hired the Byron Company to photograph his guests in a small studio set up for the purpose. Some of the resulting portrait stills of people in fancy dress recalled the costume portraits from the 18th century. Elsie de Wolfe was all in white satin, in a dress reminiscent of that shown in Boucher's lively, sketch-like portrait of Madame de Pompadour in the Louvre. Elsewhere, other groups of guests cluster and pose in their own tableaux vivants. Even when parties were not explicitly coded as 18th century masquerades, they were understood as such in the press, perhaps a testament to the imaginative lure of the period. At Alva Vanderbilt's 1883 masquerade to inaugurate her Petit Chateau, her home at 660 Fifth Avenue, many guests deviated from a strictly 18th century model. Alice Vanderbilt was dressed by Worth as Electric Light. The enterprising Miss Kate Fearing-Strong made an appearance as a cat, wearing an embalmed feline in her headdress and cattails sewn onto her skirt. But the press needed no more details than the abundance of diamonds, the impossibly chic hour of the dinner service, 2 o'clock in the morning, and the fact that 18 men, including Cornelius Vanderbilt II, attended as Louis XVI to pronounce the party French and fashionable, a scene never outdone by the gayest court of Europe. Part 3, Collecting Provenance. On January 31st, 1912, Matilda Gay, socialite, diarist, and spouse of the Paris-based American painter Walter Gay, visited the French town of Grasse. This is how she described the day in her journal, which is kept here at the Frick Art Reference Library. I quote, "At Grasse, nestling in the hills, we visited the house for which Fragonard painted the room panels, bought by Mr. Morgan, now in his London home. The house itself has a certain air. It is built on a terrace, has a coat of arms over the door, and a garden at the side. We were at first refused an entrance, as the proprietor lives there, but the maid told us that an exception was made for artists. So we sailed in on Walter's prerogative. In the salon were copies of the celebrated wall panels, placed where the famous originals had been. They looked so familiar. Walter and Matilda Gay would next see the Fragonard panels, this time the real ones, in this very place, when Walter Gay painted the Fragonard room at the request of Helen Clay Frick in 1926. Matilda's experience of the Fragonard panels as they move between Grasse, London, and New York gives us the sense that the work of art goes on. It changes context, yes, but it keeps the fundamental aura of its creator and of its time period. It is this same notion, connection and continuity, that the Goncourt tried hard to articulate in their scholarship. Like all devotees of the 18th century, Matilda Gay was vocal about acknowledging the importance of the brothers in reviving interest in the Rococo. In 1905, she asserted that the brothers, quote, had made the 18th century and Japanese art the fashion by their books. What she does not express directly, but illustrates beautifully in that journal entry of 1912, is that the Goncourt honored the historical experience of art, almost as much as the material object itself. It must be said that the Goncourt's writings about art history are far from perfect. It has been pointed out, for instance, that their catalogue raisonné of the works of Antoine Watteau, which appeared in 1875, does not reflect the most up-to-date methodology, even for the time period. They had not made the effort to study all of Watteau's paintings in person. Instead, they preferred to foreground their own deeply personal readings of his oeuvre. Nonetheless, their version of art history, while emotional and subjective, is founded on a deep interest in archival sources. It turns out that all of those primary documents over which Edmond gloats in La Maison d'un Artiste, ferreted out from Parisian bouquinistes or rescued from the dust heap, came in handy. In this sense, their writing marks a critical shift from pure object-focused connoisseurship to a new ethos of contextual study and research. In keeping with this role, it's fitting that the Goncourt were literally welcomed into museums on this side of the Atlantic. For institutions actively accessioned their likenesses in the early 20th century. In 1903, the Met was given a bronze portrait of Edmond de Goncourt. The same institution purchased Bracquemont's etched portrait of Edmond de Goncourt in 1922, and the Cleveland Museum of Art acquired William Rothenstein's 1897 lithograph of Edmond de Goncourt in 1917. And those who occupied the American art world took their work seriously. In 1913, Met curator Bryson Burroughs referred knowledgeably to the Goncourt's texts. By 1916, the collector Henry Huntington owned a copy of L'Art du XVIIIe siècle. In 1920, an inventory of Henry Clay Frick's personal library lists a copy of La Femme au XVIIIe siècle. And by 1923, the Frick Art Reference Library had acquired a complete set of their books. I hardly need tell you about this resource, established by Helen Clay Frick in 1920, 6 years before she helped create an art history department at the University of Pittsburgh. But you may be less familiar with the Paris-based librarian and art historian Clotilde Bruyère, the lady who appears all the way to the right of my slide. Ms. Frick hired her to source artist monographs, exhibition and auction catalogs, and photographs from European museums, booksellers, and art dealers. Bruyère was remarkably well placed to fulfill these responsibilities. Not only did she serve from 1918 onward as librarian of the Bibliothèque d'Art et d'Archéologie, founded by Jacques Doucet, but she was an art historian in her own right. At Ms. Frick's request, Bruyère conducted research on specific works of art belonging to the museum. In 1932, she investigated the date at which Boucher's Arts and Sciences panels had left Pompadour's Château de Crécy. That same year, she searched for details concerning the installation of Fragonard's Progress of Love panels at Louvciennes, and for archival documentation of Madame du Barry's commission. Some of the letters Bruyère received from Ms. Frick contain requests for copies of the documents themselves for inclusion in the museum's growing object files. The Goncourt-like desire to reconstruct the complicated lives of the works entrusted to her care undoubtedly prompted Ms. Frick to acquire, in 1922, a lively oil sketch by Fragonard. This was a study of the second of the 4 original Progress of Love panels. The painting did not then have much of a provenance. Little was known of its history. But it was clearly related to the whirling group of girls converging around a white-clad central figure in the panel in question. It was stored on site at the Frick Art Reference Library, sometimes in the vault, sometimes in Miss Frick's office. It functioned almost like a document, fleshing out information on the main panels, like another piece of the art historical evidence that Bruyère continued to gather. And the story does not end here. The structures and resources set into place by Helen Clay Frick and other Goncourt-minded Francophiles ensure that 18th century French art in America continues to inspire investigation and reflection. In the course of research for my 2017 exhibition, America Collects, I was able to add the following to the provenance of the little study. It appeared at auction at the Hôtel Drouot in Paris in May 1906, at the sale of none other than fashion designer Jacques Doucet. Walter Gay may have seen it there, for he attended this auction. It was next in the collection of industrialist Camille Gros, one of France's most important collectors of 18th century French painting. Moving from the collection of the fashion designer to the industrialist to the Frick Art Reference Library, the little study was brought in 1973 to Miss Frick's Pittsburgh residence. Today it hangs at the Frick Art and Historical Center. It is perhaps the most Goncourt of the works I have mentioned this evening. A sketch-like memento of Fragonard's glorious ensemble about love and desire, a souvenir of a royal souvenir. Although several times removed from its original state and transformed by its journey to America, it still has the power to fascinate. Thank you.
Hello, hello.
Questions, comments for the speakers?
Thank you. I'm curious about the contradiction or apparent contradiction in the Goncourt Brothers' interest in the Rococo. Because if you look at, for example, you mentioned Huysmans. He was interested in Moreau, and that was consistent with his particular interest at the time after Zola. So they were disciples of Zola. They were, naturalistic writers. So I'm curious as to why the Rococo. It seems like a complete contradiction in terms of their novels. That's something that just occurred to me during the lectures, which I'd like you to elaborate on, please. Thank you.
Is it on? Did you turn it on?
All right, I think it's working now. Yes, complete contradiction, and again, I touched on the subject simply to say that the art collecting was really a refuge. It was a pursuit, a private pursuit that was meant to shield from the modern industrial society. So Huysmans had a very, very different outlook onto art. He was a great art critic. By the way, Baudelaire, the Goncourts, Zola, Huysmans, Mallarmé, all of them were great, great art critics. You might even say that some of the greatest, if not the greatest, French 19th century writers, with the possible exception of Victor Hugo, were all great art critics. And some of them were inspired by modernity, most famously Baudelaire, but also Mallarmé, and others veered into the realm of decadence, and that's Goncourt and Huysmans. They had a very different aesthetic sensibilities, but I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. The idea is that collecting the world of imagination, these flights of fancy, were a way of escaping from daily realities of a society that was being transformed radically. All we have to do is think of Baron Haussmann the changing face of Paris in the 19th century, et cetera, et cetera. I think there was a question.
Yes, I'm really curious now to read the book of the lower classes. So I want to make sure I understand the name of that book. And was this secondhand, or did they take drugs? Did they actually get involved in this?
So I hope the next question will be for Yuriko, but let me just answer this very quickly. They are the pioneers of naturalism. Long before that developed in other parts of the world. They visited the wards, the hospital wards. They went all over the place. They took notes. They had a writing style that was perhaps not as straightforward as Zola, but they were certainly the inspiration for Zola and many others. There's a number of novels translated into English. Manette Salomon is an interesting one. Germinie Lacerteuse, the one that I mentioned. There's La Fille Elisa. All of these novels have been translated and are worth reading. Manette Salomon is probably the most interesting because it is a novel about how a young artist can get corrupted by society. There's just one thing that I do want to say, completely unrelated to your question, but since Yuriko mentioned the name Jacques Doucet 3 times, there's something that some of you, David, for example, I'm sure knows. Jacques Doucet, who was a famous couturier, also changed his taste radically in the 1920s. And he gave up all the old masters with the beautiful salon, 18th century salon that we saw. Was inspired by Art Deco, had an Art Deco ensemble before he died in 1929. And he purchased what is arguably the most famous painting of the 20th century, a painting that is now in New York. What painting is that? Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by Picasso. So, yeah. So talk of a turnaround. Anyway, taste does have its, it changes. Yeah.
Other questions? Questions for Dr. Jackal? Oh, here we go.
I wish to thank you for bringing forth the name of Huysmans, des Esseintes, because the greatest honor has just been paid in France to Huysmans, the Édition de la Pléiade, of well over 1,000 pages of all of his works. Also, I would like to mention a name that was not mentioned, but perhaps could have been. It was my great pleasure to have known personally Louis Galantière, who translated the Goncourt journals, 1851 to 1870. Thank you.
And by Huysmans, there's also a marvelous book called La Cathédrale that is also worth reading. We need a question for Yuriko.
Okay, one question over there.
Thank you. Could you elaborate on the connection between Edmond Goncourt's affinity for Japanese prints and Japanese art generally and the principal theme of this evening's discussion of the withdrawal from the world impetus that motivated so much of what happened in their life?
I think that it has something to do with there was an otherworldly quality in the kind of Japanese art that they looked at. It had to do with exoticism. It had to do with long sweeping lines, with a way of sometimes simplifying reality, but always with a formal trait. And I think what appealed to Edmond de Goncourt mostly is in Japanese art, at least the kind of Japanese art that he looked at, which is what Bing and other gentlemen dealers of the 19th century brought to France, to Paris. It is that sense of the sweeping line, the arabesque. And this line, Goncourt identified a little bit with the refinement of the 18th century. So for him, there was something in common between the sophistication of Japanese art, but also of Japanese life, which was full of rituals, very elaborate, old society, old-fashioned society, and the Ancien Régime, but on a purely formal level, this is expressed by a particular fondness for sweeping lines in Japanese printmaking and also in Japanese books, objects like the ones I mentioned during my talk. I hope this answers your question.
I hadn't heard before that the Goncourt brothers were anti-Semitic. I'm aware that of Degas' anti-Semitism, and that he saw Jews as part of a new economy, agents of change who were destroying the Paris that he loved. And of course, I'm aware of Zola's role in the Dreyfus affair. I'm just wondering if you could say more about the Goncourt brothers and their anti-Semitism and how you interpret it.
Well, I think it's something that I felt was important to touch on, passingly, because it is there. It's part of their philosophy. I think it's very much linked with, they're sort of part of a quite conservative part of French society, very strongly royalist, really holding on to old strictures, very anti-commercialization, industrialization. And I think that they associated Jewish groups with kind of an era of change that they were not happy with. It's something that it's complicated to think about as someone who, in some ways I quite like their writing. I like how they celebrate the 18th century. That's obviously a period that I spend a great deal of time thinking about. So I think it's one of the things that is complicating about them. I think it does need to be stated because I wouldn't want to be, thought of as just celebrating their achievement. I think it has to be nuanced a little bit, but it's a complicating fact.
Okay, we have one last question.
Both of you showed images of the house that they shared together. One of the first ones had one of the brothers' stocking feet practically on the mantelpiece. Does the residence or the building survive?
I believe the building is still there, but completely transformed. So there's very little of its original appearance, and nothing really survives except for so Edmond, as I think I quoted, wanted everything to be dispersed at auction, there's works in various museum collections. Yuriko, you talked about this, that have a Goncourt Provenance. There's been exhibitions, one at the Musée d'Orsay devoted to the Goncourts, to their taste, but there hasn't been a book in which, for example, there's one would try to reconstruct the various collections, especially given the fact that in those days auction catalogs did not have very many pictures, actually very few pictures. So we have to do guesswork in order to know what was actually in the collection. Some works we know of, such as the Watteau, which is part of the Raffaelli painting. Others, it is guesswork.
Okay, now you can all join us in the garden court. If we have further questions for the speakers, I'm sure they'd be happy to